I was reading a report this week about a private group chat. And these weren't, teenagers in a basement somewhere. These were members of young Republican groups, people in their 20s, their 30s. And the things they were saying, honestly, it was almost hard to believe. They were actually joking about putting political opponents in gas chambers. They talked about slavery, referred to Black people as monkeys. And one person just flat out typed, "I like Hitler." Mm-hmm. You read that and your first instinct, right? You wait for the next part of the story. You expect the swift, universal condemnation from party leadership, the embarrassment, the immediate disavowal. But then the story takes this turn. The vice president, J.D. Vance, he gets asked about it on a show, and he just brushes it off completely. Said they were nothing more than, quote, edgy, offensive jokes. That's what kids do, he said. Grow up. And that moment, that casual, almost bored dismissal of just unambiguous bigotry right from the highest levels of government, it felt like watching a bright red line one you always assumed was drawn in permanent ink just quietly get erased. It really made me wonder, if that's not a red line anymore, what is? Okay, so let's unpack this a bit. We're doing a deep dive here to really analyze that specific moment, that dismissal, as, well, a symptom maybe. A symptom of this quiet erasure of democratic boundaries. Our mission really is to understand how extremism becomes so normalized that behavior we once found completely unacceptable just gets shrugged off as edgy. Mm-hmm. And it forces you, the listener, to question where the true lines of acceptable political behavior actually lie now.
Right. And what's fascinating, or maybe disturbing here, is that to really get how such a fundamental boundary just vanishes, we need to look beyond just the politician who, waves it away. We have to dive deep into, I think, three interconnected forces. First, the psychological appeal that makes people vulnerable to these strongman figures. Why do they resonate? Second, the historical context, particularly post-fascist populism, which sort of provides the political blueprint. And third, the structural factors, and this is key: media, technology, and weakened institutions that are really accelerating this normalization of extremism.
That opening story is pretty shocking, but it connects directly to this slower, grinding process of institutional erosion. I read this account. It was from a longtime civil servant in Washington, D.C., a guy who started his career back in the 1980s. And he witnessed this shift firsthand. He described how way back when, even just the appearance of impropriety by a public official, not even the act itself, just the appearance, that was enough to trigger serious bipartisan shame, investigations. It often ended careers. The social cost, it was high.
That social cost, that expectation of shame, it was a critical guardrail, wasn't it? An unofficial one, maybe, but powerful. Mm-hmm. It forced leaders to at least pretend to uphold certain standards, even if maybe privately they were cynical about them.
Exactly. But he said the strangest part, looking back over the last decade or so, it wasn't just watching the rules get broken, it was watching the public and even his own really seasoned colleagues slowly become numb to it all. He watched leaders openly suggest things. Things like using federal agencies for political retaliation, stuff that would have been seen as dictatorial, like jokes 20 years ago. And then he'd see them discussed seriously on news panels as if they were legitimate political tactics. He actually called it institutional gaslighting, where the shared history of how things should operate was just constantly denied in real time. And it got replaced by this new, almost brutal acceptance.
That phrase, institutional gaslighting, that's really powerful. It captures it perfectly. It's that process, right? Where a standards of what's acceptable behavior gets moved so gradually, so incrementally, that people eventually just forget where the original standard was even drawn. And when we analyze how political stability erodes, we absolutely need to look beyond just the general public. We have to examine how political elites themselves contribute to shifting that center.
Yeah, and that brings us right to this dynamic of voter change versus candidate behavior change. We often just assume, right, that the increased importance, the salience of these culturally resonant issues, things like race, immigration, religion in recent elections, we assume it must mean the voters themselves are just becoming drastically more polarized or extreme.
That's the default assumption, absolutely. But the analysis, well, it's a bit more nuanced than that. While the voter base certainly does polarize, there's analysis suggesting that the statistical increase in the importance of these cultural issues in elections, it's significantly influenced by candidate positioning, the choices the leaders themselves make, perhaps even more so than by fundamental shifts in how voter attitudes are actually distributed across the population.
Okay, so how does that actually play out? Like in a real election?
Well, take the comparison between the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections. That's a good example. Analysis show that attitudes related to immigration, religion, and race were far more statistically salient, meaning they predicted the vote better in 2016. But that correlation didn't just grow because voters suddenly became, way more racist or xenophobic overnight. It grew because the candidates moved further apart.
Ah, okay. So the distance between the two parties on issues like, say, immigration, it just dramatically increased. And that forced voters to prioritize that issue more when they went to the polls.
Precisely. For instance, analysts observed that white voters perceived Hillary Clinton as significantly more liberal on immigration than they had viewed Barack Obama just 4 years earlier. And at the same time, they saw Donald Trump as far, far more conservative on those same cultural issues than they had seen Mitt Romney. So as candidates move further and further apart on an issue, the statistical relationship between that issue and how people actually vote gets bigger. The candidates themselves, by staking out these more extreme polarized positions, they are actively defining what's politically important. They're activating cultural divisions, not just responding to a shifting voter base.
Wow. That's powerful. It means the leadership isn't just following the electorate, they're actively shaping it. And in doing that, they're making extreme rhetoric more normal, more acceptable. And then you see dedicated public servants go from being shocked by misconduct to just being tired. That fatigue you mentioned, that's the sound of democratic norms dissolving, isn't it? It's the institutional shrug that basically confirms, yeah, that red line has been successfully erased.
And this erosion, this fatigue, it creates the necessary conditions, the fertile ground for the kind of leader we're talking about to really thrive. The institutionally fatigued public, they become ready for simplicity. They become ready for strength.
Right. The erosion of norms only really matters if there's an audience out there ready to embrace this new, maybe more brutal standard. Which brings us to the psychological mechanisms, what actually fuels the appeal of the strongman. Let's go back to that historical parallel you mentioned earlier, the one from the source material, about desperation kind of overriding ideology. Try to imagine yourself. Put yourself in Central Europe in the early 1930s. You're maybe a middle-class shopkeeper. The government seems paralyzed, right? Constantly stuck in these complex ideological squabbles. Meanwhile, your savings have vanished, inflation is just crushing you, and your whole community feels humiliated on the world stage. The system just appears weak, totally incapable of solving basic problems.
That profound sense of chaos, loss, dislocation, that's the fertilizer, isn't it? The perfect breeding ground for authoritarian movements.
Yep.
The leader who comes along promising strength, promising action. They offer a psychological solution, not just a political one, to that systemic chaos.
And so when you go to the rally, the person on stage, they aren't offering you some nuanced, complex 10-point policy solution. They're promising to act decisively, to restore order, and crucially, to define clear enemies who are responsible for your suffering. That appeal seems rooted much more in desperation than in some deep ideological conversion. People are choosing order over complexity.
Absolutely. And this phenomenon, it rests on these underlying conditions of instability and that desperate search for order. Think about post-WWI Europe. The trauma was just immense. Mass death from the war, the Spanish flu pandemic, hyperinflation wiping out savings, then the Great Depression. It created this complete societal break, a really violent rupture between the past and the future.
Now, thankfully, we haven't experienced a single shattering event quite on that scale. I mean, the scale of loss and economic collapse back then was just exponentially greater than anything we've seen recently.
That's true. The scale is different. But experts raise a really key question here. Even if the American experience avoids one single catastrophe like that, is it possible that a series of continuous smaller shocks could cause a similar cumulative kind of societal trauma and dislocation? Think about it. We've endured 9/11, the sort of permanent shadow of endless wars, the 2008 Great Recession that wiped out generational wealth for so many, and then the massive social and economic disruption of the COVID pandemic, this chronic insecurity, this persistent feeling of being knocked off balance. That's a powerful driver for anti-democratic change-seeking movements.
So it's the lack of stability, the lack of predictability. That's the real fuel here.
Yes. Behavioral psychology suggests this kind of chronic trauma can genuinely, rewire the brain, as some put it. When people feel profoundly displaced, it can trigger a primal impulse to avoid any further shocks and to seek the stability of a simplified, often mythologized past. This is what creates that vulnerability to the leader who promises to return things to the imaginary good old days, before all the current chaos began.
And this feeds directly into that political psychology analysis suggesting fear is surging. When existential anxieties are high, people just gravitate towards certainty.
Absolutely. Those existential anxieties, they drive a profound yearning for order and predictability. And this yearning, it privileges simplistic concepts that lack nuance. It's a cognitive drive, sometimes called the need for closure. When you're stressed and fearful, you don't want a 500-page policy white paper, right? You want a simple answer and a clear target for blame.
Which inherently gives an advantage to leaders who, well, talk tough and validate the public's rage.
Exactly. Leaders capitalize on the public's fear of being victimized by expressing aggression towards socially sanctioned targets. This is something the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School analyzed decades ago. How mass culture can reinforce simple, often aggressive patterns of thinking, focusing blame on clear scapegoats, whether political opponents, immigrants, or other marginalized groups. They provide certainty by clearly defining who is inside the group and who is the existential threat outside.
And this demand for simplicity seems intrinsically tied to what's often called the authoritarian mindset. Can you define that for us and maybe explain the cognitive link?
Sure. We're talking about right-wing authoritarianism, or RWA. Fundamentally, it's defined as a desire for conformity over autonomy. It's really a constellation of three deep-seated tendencies. First, submission to established authorities. Unquestioning obedience, almost. Second, aggression against anyone those authorities deem to be norm violators. And third, traditionalism, meaning a rigid adherence to perceived group conventions and values.
Okay, so what are the psychological characteristics of someone who scores high on this RWA scale?
Well, they tend to exhibit several key cognitive traits. RWA correlates pretty strongly with low cognitive engagement and a high need for what's called epistemic certainty, that rigid, black and white framework we just discussed. They show indicators like closed-mindedness and cognitive inflexibility. This means they often perform poorly on tests that require flexible thinking or switching frames of reference easily.
So they actively resist complexity and nuance.
They don't just resist it, they're often genuinely uncomfortable with it. The core motivational need seems to be enforcing in-group values through conformity. And this cognitive inflexibility makes them particularly prone to aggression against perceived threats to the status quo. So, if a strongman leader defines an opponent, say, a minority group or an independent judge, as a threat to the established order, those high on RWA are psychologically motivated to join in the aggression against that person or group, often regardless of the objective facts or the legal context. Obedience really trumps critical evaluation.
Before we move on, I want to just revisit that debate on the drivers of this support. Is it purely economic anxiety, or is it more cultural backlash, the status threat idea?
Historically, they're often linked, aren't they? Economic distress has consistently led to increased xenophobia. You see this clearly in the 1930s collapse, linking directly to the rise of nationalism and scapegoating in Germany. Those who focus only on cultural backlash sometimes miss that foundational economic element. However, and this is critically interesting in contemporary research, there's evidence for a causal sequence working in the opposite direction.
What do you mean? Like candidate preference is actually driving the adoption of certain attitudes, not the other way around?
It's exactly that. Some research suggests that candidate support itself can cause voters to adopt more racially hostile or protectionist views. It's not simply that a highly protectionist voter finds a candidate who matches their existing views. Instead, once people decide to support a particular leader, they then adopt the racial hostility or the trade protectionism or the foreign policy views that leader espouses. They're essentially aligning their beliefs with their chosen in-group and their chosen authority figure.
So if the candidate suddenly pivots on a major issue like trade or foreign alliances, the base tends to pivot right along with them to maintain that loyalty to the authority figure.
That's what some of the data suggests, yes. Surveys during the 2016 campaign, for example, showed Republican voters becoming significantly less interventionist in foreign policy and more protectionist on trade. These were shifts that directly aligned with the candidate's stated positions at the time, indicating that preference often drives policy attitude adoption rather than the reverse. The loyalty to the leader seems to be the primary psychological driver. Okay, so having established that psychological vulnerability, let's turn to the political vehicle these movements often use, modern populism. And it's really important, I think, to clearly distinguish this from its historical predecessor, classical fascism.
Right. So what defined classical fascism? Thinking Mussolini, Hitler.
Classical fascism was fundamentally dictatorial. It relied on totalitarian rule, the use of violence, not just as a tactic, but as a political end in itself, a sort of purifying force. And critically, the total elimination of political discussion and plurality. There were no meaningful elections, no independent institutions allowed.
Okay. And modern populism, the kind that emerged after World War II. How is that different?
Modern populism is often defined as an authoritarian electoral form of democracy. It emerged mainly after 1945. Peronism in Argentina is a classic example, and it was often a conscious rejection of classical fascism's explicit dictatorial rule, which was by then universally condemned. So populism uses elections, but it maintains those authoritarian leadership qualities, an anti-liberal approach meaning it dismisses checks and balances, and it often incorporates reformulated fascist ideological ideas like extreme nationalism or an anti-enlightenment focus on feeling over fact.
So it's like authoritarianism learned to operate within the constraints of a post-war democratic world. It uses the shell of democracy elections, but kind of empties out the core spirit, which is liberal pluralism.
Precisely. Populist regimes act and claim to decide everything in the name of the monolithic people. They use democratic means like elections, but they continuously work to limit other democratic procedures, things like judicial independence or media freedom. They chip away at the substance.
The danger today, though, it feels like the line between these two types of movements, populism and maybe neo-fascism, is becoming dangerously fluid. When does populism actually cross that boundary?
Well, scholars often point to a critical transition point. Populism usually starts with generic enemy rhetoric targeting the elites, globalists, traitors, abstract categories. It transitions towards neo-fascism when it moves from that to articulating an identifiable racial or religious foe. And crucially, when it transitions the conflict polarization from just rhetoric into actual political violence. When the state or the movement's followers begin using systematic violence against a clearly defined ethnic or religious enemy, that line has arguably been crossed.
And we see these remarkably consistent behavioral patterns among contemporary strongmen who operate in this kind of fluid space, don't we?
Absolutely. When you analyze figures like, say, Trump in the US or Berlusconi in Italy, and even reaching back to Mussolini himself, they share a distinct style, a flamboyant theatrical way of speaking, a pattern of chronic, often blatant dishonesty that seems designed to disorient the public, and a relentless pattern of questioning the rule of law and the separation of powers.
Yeah, they often introduce themselves as law and order candidates, but then their first target seems to be the justice system itself.
Exactly. They promote order for the public while simultaneously seeking to dismantle the judicial and legislative checks on their own power. Berlusconi, for instance, consistently attacked the judiciary, calling it a cancer. Trump attacked an American judge based on his Mexican heritage, an attack which his own party's leadership at the time called the textbook definition of racism. They used their supposed popular mandate to constantly push the limits of acceptable democratic behavior.
Now, if the U.S. continues down this kind of illiberal path, some scholars suggest it won't look like 1930s Europe. It would look, quote, fascist like the Americans. What makes the American version of illiberalism distinct?
Scholars usually point to two key, unique factors that are deeply rooted in American history and culture. First, the U.S. has this long, entrenched illiberal tradition rooted specifically in race slavery, Jim Crow laws, the genocide against indigenous people. This tradition provides a unique, homegrown template for oppression that is distinct from, say, European ethno-nationalism.
And what are the other key differences?
The specific composition of the current movement is quite unique. The core base of support for today's American illiberalism relies heavily on hard-right evangelical Christians. They introduce a powerful theological component and a desire for cultural supremacy that often dictates policy positions. And furthermore, there's the uniquely American factor of the near-unchecked private possession of weapons of war by many followers of the movement.
Right, so you have this highly mobilized, ideologically distinct base combined with widespread access to military-grade firepower. That's a variable that just wasn't present in 1920s Italy or Germany in quite the same configuration.
That combination fundamentally changes the structural risks involved. While scholars often maintain cautious optimism, arguing that the U.S.'s deeply embedded institutions are probably stronger than those in Italy and Germany were a century ago, the caveat always remains. When these forces align, history suggests that democratic decay can happen with terrifying speed.
And the pace of that decay seems dramatically accelerated today by digital tools and our current media structures. We really have to look at how technology amplifies the normalization of extreme rhetoric, like the kind we saw dismissed in that opening story. I remember reading that anecdote you mentioned about the father sharing an AI-generated video. It showed the strongman leader dumping toxic waste on protesters.
Yes, that anecdote perfectly captures the modern mechanism of radicalization, I think. How did the father respond when his daughter challenged him on it?
Well, his daughter messaged him, right? Pointed out the video was obviously fake, AI-generated, and depicted really aggressive violence against political opponents. And he replied basically, I know it's not real, it's just a joke, they should lighten up. But then he added the critical line, but maybe it's what they deserve for blocking traffic. And the analysis you pointed to calls this out perfectly. The AI content isn't really about deception anymore. It's about permission. His father wasn't radicalized by that video in isolation. The video was more like a tool that affirmed a radicalization that was already happening. It uses the format of a joke to normalize genuinely hateful, violent ideas. It offers a kind of digital license to dehumanize opponents, softening the ground for real-world aggression.
That digital license is right at the heart of contemporary security challenges. Today's domestic terrorists are often what we call lone offenders. Individuals who mobilize to violence with very little or sometimes no formal organizational structure. They tend to radicalize intensely and often very quickly online in what experts are now calling an ecosystem of right-wing terror.
So it sounds like they're technically acting alone, but they're drawing all their fuel and justification from this continuous digital network.
Exactly. The term lone actor can be highly misleading, actually. Their so-called independent radicalization requires an existing sophisticated ecosystem, one that deliberately provides the narratives, validates the rage, and actively seeks to inspire mass violence. These individuals mobilize rapidly and independently, which makes them incredibly challenging for law enforcement to identify and disrupt before they actually strike.
And this rapid, maybe deep-seated radicalization, it's fundamentally amplified by the architecture of social media platforms themselves, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The mechanics are designed for engagement, not necessarily for civility or truth. Social media algorithms are engineered to drive clicks, views, shares. That's the business model. And extremist content that evokes strong emotions, usually fear or outrage, is inherently highly engaging. Therefore, the algorithms often boost this content into users' feeds simply because it's profitable. It keeps people on the platform longer. So the platform mechanics are not neutral. They act as a filter that actively incentivizes and distributes extremism. They essentially become editors or publishers of radicalizing material, whether they intend to or not.
This successful digital strategy allows modern populists to completely bypass the old checks and balances like traditional media. It connects directly to that theory of mass society, right?
Yes. Mass society theory argues that as traditional community structures, things like labor unions, local political parties, even neighborhood associations weaken, which happens due to industrialization and now digitalization. Mass media fills that void, and this leaves the public psychologically kind of unmoored and acutely vulnerable to demagoguery. Populist leaders exploit this vulnerability by defining the independent media as a key adversary, famously calling them the enemy of the people.
And then they use their own media channels, Twitter, Rumble, whatever, and social media to establish that direct, unmediated line of communication with their followers.
That's precisely the goal. They replace journalistic scrutiny, which demands facts, evidence, conflicting opinions, with a singular vertical voice, the leader's voice. They propagate the fantasy that traditional media offers nothing but lies and corruption, while the unmediated voice of the leader somehow represents the truth and the silent majority. This is essentially post-fascist propaganda, but adapted perfectly for the digital age. The end result, replacing a diversity of voices with a singular, unchallengeable one, is achieved much faster and more efficiently than ever before. So we have to turn now to the final guardrails. When historical democracies fail, it's often the institutions that concede their power first, sometimes before popular opinion has fully shifted. And the most jarring institutional parallel that scholars studying this moment identify concerns the legal systems.
You're referring to that comparison between the German Enabling Act of 1933 and the recent controversial Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity.
Yes, this comparison is crucial, not because they're identical, but because it highlights the potential withdrawal of institutional checks. The German Enabling Act, as you know, effectively granted Hitler enormous dictatorial authority. It allowed him to bypass the Reichstag, suspend constitutional rights. It wasn't technically an illegal coup. It was an act sanctioned by the existing legal structure at the time.
And the contemporary parallel people are drawing.
Well, the recent U.S. Supreme Court ruling granting presidents broad immunity from prosecution for official acts, according to a consensus among many legal scholars. It represents the legal institutions potentially withdrawing their role as a check on executive abuse of power. Just as the Reichstag failed to check Hitler, this ruling, some argue, grants the president broad legal impunity for executive actions. The pattern we see is the leader consistently attempting to undermine the justice system and consolidate power by unifying the branches under himself, rather than maintaining that crucial constitutional separation of powers.
Okay, so if the institutional and legal checks are showing signs of, well, failing or weakening, what are the last red lines in the system? We have to look beyond the political elite now and ask, what are the public's limits? What would actually make the strongman's own base break away?
Right. And polling, voter discussions, they do reveal that even staunch supporters have specific deal breakers. These function as final behavioral red lines. They tend to be more transactional boundaries. The loyalty rests on a promise, stability, economic security, adherence to perceived core values. If those fundamental promises are seen to be betrayed, that loyalty can collapse surprisingly quickly.
Can you give us the top examples? What are those public red lines?
Domestically, the number one red line consistently cited is pushing through cuts to popular entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicaid. This is a hugely sensitive issue, absolutely crucial for older and working-class segments of the base. Other ideological deal breakers might include radically expansive federal regulation or maybe wealth taxes, things that fundamentally betray core small government conservative principles. The support seems conditional on the leader adhering to a certain kind of fiscal or ideological contract.
And what about on foreign policy?
There, the top red line appears to be the overt mistreatment of allies, or the perceived betrayal of long-standing American values abroad. Specifically, that announced proposal that Ukraine must surrender territory to Russia caused significant alarm and alienation among many traditionally staunch supporters. It signaled a break in the traditional strong-on-defense Republican stance. These actions challenge the transactional nature of the leader's appeal.
So the strongman's power, while it looks robust, might actually be deeply conditional. If that economic or ideological contract gets broken, the base might just walk away.
Yes, that's the theory based on voter sentiment. But ultimately, we need to differentiate between public opinion shifts and the factors that historically cause authoritarian regimes to actually collapse, sometimes regardless of the leader's popularity at that moment. Experts identify specific, often physical, extreme measures of exit that are independent of approval ratings.
Okay, what are those final physical factors, the ones that really end these regimes?
First, continued and growing protests that the state simply cannot contain or suppress, when mobilization reaches a point that overwhelms the state's capacity for enforcement. Second, the military refusing to follow illegal orders. Historically, authoritarian regimes have faced collapse when key segments of the military or government elites become sufficiently disillusioned or fearful to plot resistance. Think of the Stauffenberg plot against Hitler. Third, economic collapse that cannot be masked by rhetoric. When the fundamental cost of groceries, housing, fuel becomes undeniably catastrophic, public pain overrides propaganda. And finally, the dwindling and disappearance of international support, which removes the regime's legitimacy on the world stage and often cuts off access to global markets and resources. These factors represent the ultimate, often non-negotiable checks on authoritarian power. Hashtag tag outro. So what our deep dive really reveals, I think, is this convergence of powerful forces that enable extremism to normalize. That casual dismissal of unambiguous bigotry, which started our whole conversation. It's facilitated by these deep psychological needs for order in times of stress. It's fueled by the structural polarization driven by candidate behavior, not just voter shifts. And it's massively amplified by digital tools that quickly spread and affirm dehumanization. All of this combines, really, to facilitate the quiet, collective erosion of democratic norms that we've been talking about.
And what becomes really clear is that the guardrails protecting democracy, they aren't just legal documents or political institutions on paper. They are internal, they're psychological, they're behavioral, both for the leaders and for us, the public. And it is inherently difficult to push back when the institutions themselves legally withdraw their checks and when the public is just worn down by constant crises. While we know and hope that institutions in the U.S. are historically strong, history also suggests that when these things start to go, they can go very quickly.